parents went there when it was Abilene Christian College. My brother and sister both have their degrees from there, and my brother's son. And I think that's it.
Yeah, that's a great school.
So yeah, that part of Texas, and a bunch of my family's from that part of Texas too. So I don't know your town, but I know that area well.
It's home. That's, that's just going back home. I love it. That's where I was born and raised.
Very nice. So we are live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And yes, I stole that line from Jake Sussman. Welcome to Dyslexia Coffee Talk. We have with us today Maggie Spire. Maggie is an educator who went from elementary education to educating our incarcerated within the prison system. So Maggie, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I know you're really good friends with one of our founders, and she was really excited about having you on because she felt like the experience that you could talk about with us was so central to everything that we're talking about with dyslexia and the pipeline to prison. And she felt like you could, share some insights with that. And like you and I were discussing before we went live, from elementaries to prisons, that's a pretty big leap. What motivated you to make that leap?
Well, I just felt after 17 years of being in elementary school, it was just time for a change. I just felt a calling to do something different. I had received my master's degree in 2010, focused in reading, and that's what I wanted to do. At the time, I thought I wanted to teach college, and I was an adjunct doing that. And then my heart was just wanting to do something different. And I was kind of just looking around, and that was never the direction I thought I would go in. And I didn't really know what the ups and downs were of the prison system for education, or the ins and outs. And I applied and learned a little bit about it. And it was definitely the best experience. And I'm so glad I had a chance to do that. So it was just, I was ready to step out and do something different. And the public school system is just much different than it was when I started teaching 20 years ago. And I wanted to see another end of education.
Wow. Who were your typical students? And so first, what state were you in when you were?
Missouri.
Missouri. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What did you have? Was it a random selection of the population? Was it a specific group of people that you worked with?
There was a variety of students that I had. I had from literally 18-year-olds to 70-year-olds in my class. I started out when I first was hired into the state with the diagnostics area. So my job in the beginning was to talk with anybody that had not received their GED or their high school diploma and kind of test them and see where they stood and what I could do to help them obtain that. I had to put them on a path to see what we could do to help them. And depending on their level, they may be ready now. They could have been educated up through 10th, 11th grade and something happened and they didn't continue. And so I could pick up pretty easily. And then there were some that something happened and it'd been 20 years. Maybe they'd been incarcerated for 20 years and they were back in, and they felt ready. And so it kind of just depended on the student, but it was a select variety. And the area that we're in was mostly Caucasian men. And the majority of my group of students, I would say, were between 25 and 35, inner city men that had been most of them had been in and out several times. And they always told me their first time in was, it was more of I'm too cool. I'm not doing this. I'm young. I don't need this. And then as they got older as in their late 20s, early 30s, they would see the need and the want to do that. And so that was the majority of my population of students that would come in and be at a level where they were able to obtain it pretty quick. After about, almost 8 months, I saw an opening in the education department to be an actual teacher and have my own classroom. Again, that is not something I ever thought that I'd leap into, and I had no idea really what that entailed. And so I learned a little bit about it. I applied for the job. I got it. I got over there, and this is during COVID. And so it's a lot different, the setup of the classroom, but I was able to have 10 men at a time in my class, and which doesn't sound like a lot, but those are like big bodies. I'm used to little bitty guys, you know? And so there were 10 men at a time in my class, and I had 3 sessions. They were 2-hour long sessions. And every single person had an individualized set that they needed. One man may have really, really weakness, maybe a 5th grade level in reading, but he was great in math, science, and social studies. And so my job was to get them prepared for the high set test to receive their equivalency. And so every single person had a different individualized plan that I'd have to make for them. And so that was much different than I was used to.
Wow. So given that example, what were you finding from a literacy perspective regarding their reading ability?
It was all over their board. I'm so used to having a grade level in elementary. And even though you may have a pre-primer reader and a 4th grade reader in the same, it's not the same as having a man who's fluent and is ready to take any kind of comprehension test compared to a man that's still working on phonics. I had so many men in our system that just reading fluency was a struggle.
Mm-hmm.
What I did notice overall, and I could say the majority of my students, they struggled in reading a lot, which seemed to be due to their vocabulary and their exposure, and not just so much their academic education, but just what they were surrounded by.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a huge problem in their writing as well. And so we discussed that several times. They would write, and I'd say, this is great content. And then I would read it to them, and they would hear it, and they'd realize that's not correct. And so that was a lot of a struggle that we had to deal with, was they had never been exposed. And many of them told me, we'd never been exposed to reading and wanting to read and like reading until they were in prison, and they really didn't have any other option to do anything. And that's so heartbreaking that they were never surrounded by it. So their struggle with reading started from, so far back. And so many of them, which I'm definitely not a diagnostician, but I could see so many struggles that lean towards, man, that's a possible dyslexia. Oh goodness, this is a possible, he might have had autism, and all these things. And so I would try to talk to them individually and just kind of get to know their background to see where they were led academically, not in their choices. And they struggled. So many of them struggled from the beginning and just had no help or no support. People at home didn't support, or the school saw them as trouble and didn't seem to want to support them. So I saw a lot of heartbreaking stories that just started from the very beginning of education.
Wow. So and a lot of what we talk about too, and you brought it up, is it's not just their lack of reading ability, but it's their lack of background knowledge too, because they've not been given the proper exposure within their education to those things that they need to know in order to develop the necessary vocabulary as well.
Sure. We would pull different passages. Everything that I used to help them obtain their high sit was never written any higher than a 7th grade, maybe 8th grade level. And, research shows that most of the things we read in newspapers and all those things are not written higher than that. And they struggled. And I taught them in a way that I would teach like a 4th grade classroom. I did a lot of oral reading, discussion, pass it back to them, have them do it independently, discuss it, make notes, write they just never been taught those skills to break down how reading can literally help them pull out information. And so that was just all those skills that we learned in elementary school, middle school, of how to better comprehend something. they didn't have. And so I was trying to start back from just fluency and vocabulary to get them to that point. And so, yeah, their exposure or lack of exposure definitely played a huge part in their inability to get where they needed until they learned those skills.
Do you feel like the failure within the education that they experienced as children growing up, into men, did that contribute to the fact that they were incarcerated? Because you're talking about some fairly intelligent people.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're exactly right. And I do feel that that is a huge part. When you asked me earlier, I went from elementary to prison. I would sit there and have my students while we were in my prison classroom and think back to 17 years prior of having students. I taught the majority of my 17 years prior to that to third grade. I did second grade, I did kindergarten, but the majority, 11 of those 17 were in third grade reading. And so that was kind of my go-to how to teach. And it worked great, but I would think back to, oh goodness, I hope that I did little Johnny some good because this could be him in 20 years. And it broke my heart and it scared me because I could hear their stories, personal stories and academic stories, and think back to how little Johnny was in my classroom, 10 years ago. And that was very similar to his life and very similar to his lack of exposure. And I hope that I did just a little bit to make sure he did the best that he could. And seeing both ends of that. And I've had children in the past. I've always, for 18 years, always taught in low socioeconomic areas, always taught in Title I schools. And so having a big group of my children be low socioeconomic, they had families at home that were very similar. And I've had several students that had parents that were incarcerated, and being on the flip side and hearing dads talk about their kids at home, it was just very eye-opening. And my favorite part to having some conversations with my students in prison was, I don't want my kids to end up like this. I want them to be proud of me. I want to have my GED. I want to go home and help them with homework. And those were like, oh, so eye-opening to me to know that that's where their heart was, and they want to fix the next generation. And but I totally think that is a huge part of where their lack was growing up.
Wow, I have chills.
And it's sad, it's heartbreaking. And
yeah.
I've taught hundreds and hundreds of kids. I was always departmentalized when I taught third grade. So I had 100 kids a year ish. And so I've taught
departmentalized.
Okay. So when I taught third grade, which when I was growing up, we did not do this. You had one teacher in elementary that taught you all the subjects. But starting in third grade, in the areas that I've taught, there would be 4 or 5 teachers. So there would be math, reading, science, social studies. And so I only taught reading. I taught fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, which some parents weren't a big fan of, but their students, in my opinion, as an educator, were so much stronger as a reader because they literally had 1 hour focused solid every day to those 3 things. And I think that helps a lot in not just, we're going to do social studies while we read this book. We're going to do science while we read this book. It's literally departmentalized where everybody teaches their subject solid. And that helps a lot. But it's just heartbreaking whenever I hear their stories, and I wish I could go back and, you can literally see they are like little boys trapped in these huge men bodies, making these decisions. And this is where they are. And so many of them just wish they could go back, but they don't know how to get out.
This may not be a fair question, and I apologize in advance. How successful is the GED program? Helping these men get their GEDs, et cetera. How successful is that program?
It's okay. That's a fair question. I would say, well, let me back up a little bit and say I worked in the prison system for about 18 months and loved every moment of it. went in thinking, I mean, I was 40. It's not like I was 18 and thought I could change the world, but I was 40 and thought I could change the world. And that's why we do teaching, right? We want to go in and we're going to make a difference. And that was my thought going into this, is I was going to make a difference. And I think I did. But I went into education to help. It's like my mission, it's like my mission calling. It just happens to be in education and not in ministry. And so when I went into this field, that's what I did. And I thought I was going to do that in prison. And when I got into prison and started doing what I feel my strengths are, and I can't even tell you, 30, 40 guys pass the GED in just a few months, and the times that I had them, very successful. But somehow, later, I was told that teaching them needed to stop. That was not how we did it in prison. We handed them workbooks and gave them worksheets to do. And I didn't buck the system, but I was thinking, no, I'm a teacher. Like, I don't, that's what I do. And so all those months I had been doing everything my degrees had taught me, and my heart was leaning me to know, your students and what they're capable of, even when they don't think so. That had to stop. And that's when I left. Because a workbook's not going to do it. It didn't do it 20 years ago for them. It didn't do it, and so if done as an education program, it is so, so good for them. But like any other setting of education, they have to know you care before they do, and I showed that because that's just, I was, did elementary for so long. And I think every person deserves to have a say in what they learn and do and how they do it, and what they're strong at and what they want to do. And whenever I gave my students a voice, that became a problem. And so that was heartbreaking to me, because in my head, I wanted to make a difference. And so when I started making a difference, they bloomed, they blossomed. And I have all these letters and notes that my students wrote to me and would say stuff like, people will gripe to come to education because there's some guys that are like, this is a waste of my time. I'm not doing this. I do auto body. When I get out of here, my job's still waiting for me. They didn't see the need. And I understand that. But then there were some guys that would come to class and they would drag their feet. And then later they'd write a note and say, I appreciate, after they get their GED, I appreciate you. I would have never done this. Did I ever think I'd be able to do this? But you made me realize that I can, and you pushed me. And so that's why I showed up every day. That's what I did it for. And then whenever I felt that I was being told that wasn't what I needed to do, it was time to walk away. And I was heartbroken. I bawled my eyes out to leave prison because I felt that I was making one of the hugest impacts I could in my career there. And that's just not quite what that education system is doing. And not that they're being hindered, but they're being stalled, if that makes sense.
Well, and when they've always been stalled, you're just continuing the stall. Was that just the prison? Was that the statewide education? Where was that direction coming from?
I felt like it was coming statewide. Okay. It just trickled down to how I was told from my higher beings. Mm-hmm. But I feel that it was statewide. Of course, I've only worked in one facility for prison, and so I can't speak directly for all facilities. I think we have 28 in our state. But I felt like that was kind of the way that it was made from the top down. And just talking to my students, we would start our 2-hour classes every day, vent session, kind of like, hey, what's going on? How's everybody doing? In my head, if my students get everything, it doesn't matter if they're 5 or if they're 40 or 80, if they get whatever's on their mind and on their shoulders out, then I have a clear head to teach. And so I do that with first graders. Hey, how's it going? Anything going on? And, they'll tell you anything, like things you probably should not know. And it's the same way with men in prison. They'll tell you all about it. And we would have a 10, 15-minute vent session, and then they were good to go. And they were treated like people. And because they are, because they are men and they struggle. And once we got that out, we were able to learn, and they craved it. I mean, they would buck me for a little bit, and I would let them just sit there and be quiet, not speak, or whatever the case may be. But when they saw their peers obtaining the information or reading, I would start reading orally. And then I'd always say, I'm not going to make anybody read aloud, but you're really good at it. I would love for somebody to volunteer. We would definitely have some volunteers. And then once some people were hearing their peers volunteer, it's kind of like, oh, well, he did that. I can do that. And so they would start trying to trump each other. And it was like a competition. But my classroom was a safe place in prison. There may be different ways on their wings and in their housing units and on the yard, how they act. But in my classroom, it was a safe place. And so they were not afraid to learn. They wanted to, and they asked for it. It was wonderful.
Well, and so what I do for a living is our negotiations. And what you just described, from being able to create a safe space for people, that's so tantamount to being able to ultimately achieve anything.
Exactly.
Take a negotiation for a specific example. If I want to keep the person on their toes, I'm going to keep the anxiety levels high. I want to keep them in a defensive posture. I want them to stay scared. I want them to always be questioning, where am I going to go next? Versus, if I've got something I really need to get to the heart to, I need that person to drop their defenses and to trust me. And the only way to get somebody to trust you is to allow them to be vulnerable, but to be vulnerable with them as well. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. And our children especially need that vulnerability, because they're such vulnerable creatures. They don't know how to be defensive yet. They don't know, they don't know any of that yet. They're just these little vulnerable hearts, like walking around in the world and fully exposed and raw and pure emotional beings. And when you damage that child and then they're incarcerated later, that's, then you're adding trauma to the situation. So, I mean, what you were creating in your classroom would be so critical in order to have success, which clearly you did. It's extremely tragic that they would stop you from being able to. I mean, you were having success. They ultimately looked at you and said, we don't care that you're being successful. This isn't how we're going to do it.
Right. And I felt like it was one of those things. And why would we not do this? This is teaching. Don't we want them to be successful, was my thought. And I felt like it was just, this is the way it is. And, that's it. And you said it exactly. I feel like, when you're young, like you said, you're so vulnerable. And there have been so many layers of multiple walls put up over these men by their own choice or by others around them that they have no say over. Getting through those walls was the hugest success in itself. Then we could get the learning done. And so I made myself, like you said, very vulnerable. I had them know a little bit about my background and know that, people in here are going to judge you. And they're like, they would always say things about how people would say negative stuff to them. And I would remind them, a lot of people that work in here have done some of the same things that you have done. They just haven't been caught doing them. They are not any better than you are. They've just made different choices along the way. And once they realized that I was sincere about those things, then their walls started to come down just a little bit. But what made my heart break, and they had to do it, is once my classroom door would open wide at the end of the 2 hours, those walls would just come back up. I mean, they had to. They're in survival mode. And so, definitely, it's like, this is the way it's always been. This is the way it's going to be. I remember an actual conversation I had with a colleague, and the comment that came out of my colleague's mouth was, "There sure is a lot of laughter going on in your room." And my thought was, yeah, I mean, why wouldn't there be? And I said, yeah. And the colleague said, well, that sounds like you're having too much fun and you need to be giving them work to do. And I was so taken aback by that I didn't really have anything to say, which, if you know me well, is so rare that I wouldn't have anything to say. But I had to go back and kind of let that sink in. And I thought, that's so sad to me that this person, hopefully not this whole department, but this person feels like those two things can't happen at the same time. And to me, and not just because I taught education, but to me as a person, those two should happen at the same time. That's how they sink in. That's how you remember. That's how you have an emotion attached to your academics so that you can be successful. And I think that's a huge part of why my students they had a good time. And I would make mistakes and we would laugh at it. We would go on. And again, in the end, it made them realize that their mistakes in my class were just another part of it's what I do. I have 2 degrees. I'm up here teaching in front of you, and I still do those things too. Totally cool. We're going to just get through it. And we would laugh and joke. But again, they'd open that door and those walls would come up and they'd go in survival mode. So yeah, definitely a safe place. I had students I remember one day, it was a very interesting, you have to remember you have different ethnicities, different races, different backgrounds. And I passed out, we were always writing, the state of Missouri has you write an opinion piece to receive your high set. You have to receive a certain score. So I'm teaching them the order in which we write things and how we write a hook. I mean, like from scratch, step 1. And so we were talking about it. We always pass out the 2 opinion pieces and discuss them. I would always read them. I'd have them reread them, and then we would discuss them, or they felt comfortable enough they could talk to them in partners. That was always an option. And you have to be careful in, the prison system to do that. But anyway, we were passing these out and we got halfway through one side and one guy was looked terrified. And I said, yeah. And he said, can we get a different topic? And I said, yeah, absolutely. If you don't mind telling me why you feel that way. And he said, this is about to cause a lot of problems. And I said, okay, absolutely. So I took them all up. And later after class, I was like, hey, so glad, first of all, that you spoke up. And I totally understand when you leave here, you guys aren't classmates anymore. You're this wing and this wing, and you stand for whatever. I said, but what was it about that piece that worried you? And he said, I just knew that there were going to be so many strong emotions on each of these that we needed to nip it before it became an issue on the yard. And so for me, and that doesn't sound like a very big deal, but for me, that was huge. He felt comfortable enough to me to go ahead and say, we're not going to do this. I'm totally not okay with this. And I talked to everybody afterwards and they were like, yeah, best choice that we could have made. We don't need that. And so I just don't know if they were in another classroom where they didn't have that openness, if that would have been discussed, or if they would have just done it or just refused to do it. And that's what happened in other classrooms. They would just refuse to do the work. Right. And so we kind of just became a close-knit little group. Every single class had their own feel, their own personality like any other class. So I enjoyed being able to work with them like that.
Oh. But I want to go back to what you said, because I think that is such a core misunderstood thing, is going back to the vulnerability piece and being criticized for having too much laughter. What you said was spot on. It's when you feel safe and you can attach emotion to what you're learning, you're more open to being able to take in more information, to challenge, to ask questions, to have ideas, that's essential for the brain. And I think a lot of people don't remember or don't understand anymore how we are emotional creatures, and emotion is absolutely tied to everything that we do. You know, as an example, when I'm in a negotiation, people have told me that I'm so shut down emotionally that sometimes I scare people because it's just like there's no emotion coming out of me at all. And what I tell those people is I'm like, there's an enormous amount of emotion going on in me inside my head that I've warred with myself for a few days going into that emotion in order to compartmentalize it. I said, but that
Right.
dialogue's still going on in my head, but it's like I've stuck a little like soldier in front of all of that emotion going, you can't have it.
Right.
Have it. But you know, but that's a choice that I've made, and it doesn't mean that I'm not taking in any of the information. It's simply that I'm exuding a specific character trait, if you will.
Yes.
But and I do that intentionally in order to control the emotions and the dialogue. And it's a very statistical, or not statistical, it's strategic, same S words, very close. It's a very strategic thing that I'm doing when I do that.
Right.
We don't, you know, our children are such emotional creatures, again, because they're pure emotion, that they need to have that emotional attachment. If they're not having that emotional attachment, then something that needs to be a red flag for people, that something's going on. That child's shutting down. Why is that child shutting down? Is, you know, are they not learning? Have they not been learning? You know, is there fear? Is there anxiety? Is there, what's going on with a child if they're not exuding that emotion? And people really need to understand that.
Absolutely. And there needs to be some kind of, like you said, a red flag, but if we don't know how to talk to the children or students of any age and open that up so that they are willing to give, there's always going to be that block, and it's going to interrupt everything academically, everything friendship wise, communication wise. And I think that's what's happened so much with so many of our incarcerated, that it just keeps going. And some of them have said to me, you know, I'm like, what is the block? You're so smart. Like, I hear you. You sound, you know, you can have a full conversation with correct grammar. You look me in the eye when you speak to me. I know that's not how you were raised. You've told me how you were raised. What's the block? You know, and they would have to get to a point where finally they would open up a little and say stuff like, I always struggled with reading. No one no one helped me. I would be called stupid. I'd go home and they would tell me I was stupid and there was no hope. I wouldn't end up, you know. And so then there goes another layer of blocking things out and not being able to open up. And the majority of them finally would crack for me, but there would always be those ones that wouldn't. And the younger they were, of course, the easier they would be able to do that for me. Not always, but the majority of the time. And the core group of people, like I mentioned earlier, that wanted to do well and could get past the fact that they hadn't in the past, and were willing to let me help them, were those guys who had been in and out and just had enough, and they wanted more. They finally wanted more. And they usually had children, usually young children, where they would start to say, like I mentioned earlier, they don't want this for their kids. They don't want their kids to feel not up to what they could be. They don't want them to ever feel dumb. That was the word they used all the time. And so that's kind of whenever they would start realizing, I can and I will, and I'm going to prove to my kids that I can, because I don't want them to do this. And that made me happy as an educator and as a mama, just because that's, no one wants their kids to go through that. And for some reason, a lot of their parents didn't or weren't there, maybe for being incarcerated. I heard a lot of stories. The majority of my students were in for drug-related charges. I would say the majority. I was in a low level security prison. And so most of them were there for drug charges. And some of them were one of those, oh, that was just a bad deal. But the majority were, this is definitely generational. And the generational was not just incarceration, it was also academic issues and no diploma and it just went so far back that it never, for them not to struggle was unfathomable. Like, why wouldn't I? My mom and dad did, and my brothers and sisters did. Um, and then no one at home helped them. And I don't know, I grew up in a small town, so I kind of know how it is. And you kind of get this label of, well, all your brothers and sisters struggled, so I'm sure you'll struggle too, and get pushed off to the side. So when they did struggle, and there could have been a huge learning disability, they were so brushed off. And these poor babies were probably the troublemakers and were brushed off for that. And they just never got the help or the label to know they needed help that they had. Like I said, they were either from tiny, tiny small towns and had a label with their last name, or huge inner cities. And they were just a number, just a dollar sign on a district. And it's heartbreaking. But yeah, breaking down that wall is huge. And I had very few men, probably over 50, that would ever break their wall down. And it just broke my heart because I wanted them to see they could and help. And just so many of them had given up on education and the fact that that was not going to happen for them. And so that I felt like I failed them so many times, and I had to remove myself emotionally from that, because I know that there's so much that you can do and try to get yourself in and know that you're going to do all you can, but some of them just, they're not ready. And I hope one day they will be, but some of them just weren't ready for me.
Yeah. Having gone to a school that my sister went to and having had the same teachers, I can definitely appreciate, oh, you're her sister. No, I'm not.
Yeah, who? I don't know that person.
Happen to have the same last name. I'm not her sister. What are you talking about?
But that's a good thing and a bad thing, depending on who your older siblings are. But definitely in these small towns, it's like the whole family, and it's just makes me so mad.
My sister ever watches this, I do love you. That was like an offset, but it did happen.
Oh goodness.
But you hit on something key, which is the generationality of this. And honestly, because we're not teaching our children to read in our classrooms today across the country, we're fostering that generational illiteracy and pipeline to prison. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. For some reason, I think culturally we tend to see prisoners as one-offs within society, something about their personality, etc. Nobody's looking at the history of, what's necessary, or it's, oh, they're just poor, the father wasn't present, of course they ended up here. Well, okay, why were they poor and why wasn't the father present? And what was fueling that? What was going into that? We're not asking those questions.
You're exactly right. We're not getting down to the root. We're brushing it off as this is the way it is. It's the way it's always been. The family's always been this way, or whatever the case may be, and not how can we go back and help that, so from here on out it doesn't continue with that family or with this group of people. And it is a generational thing with so many families. You said something earlier, I don't remember what it was, but so I have to get to them somehow, or I lose them. And so, they'd come in my office when I taught diagnostics, and I'd be like, okay, we're going to test you. They would look at me like I was crazy, because I am, a born elementary teacher. So you can do this. I'm so excited. We're going to get you your GED. And they'd be like, I'm good. I don't need that. And so once they got to know me, they just realized that that's just how I was. And I wasn't, but
you're just
a lot of times, yeah, a lot of times I'd have to get to them. And so I would just kind of stop my spiel of why they needed this. And a lot of times, and what I got to most of them, I'd say, is your mom still around? Is your mom still living? And then they'd light up. It was their mama. And yeah, my mom's still alive. She, blah, blah, blah. What does she do? Where is she? What is she? Do you get to talk to her? You communicate? We'd have this conversation 5-10 minutes. And I'd say, okay, so let's go back to that GED thing. So whenever you complete that, and I help you do that, and I put you in a gown and cap, and I take your picture, you don't think mama's going to want that? Yeah, mama would like that. And then they'd start working and they'd start lagging off a little bit. And I'd say, man, it's going to take mom a lot longer to put that picture on the fridge. Like, you're right, Spire, you're right, you're right. Okay, here we go. And it was always a mama thing. But, and I've learned with so many low socioeconomic classes that that's one of those things that a lot of people in low socioeconomic areas, that's the one thing that they're attached to. They're attached to their mama, men and women. We're that way. I was raised low socioeconomic, single parent family, just like a lot of these guys. And I would say, my mom's not here anymore, but if she was, and I'd continue and they would go, yeah, I don't want my mom to be gone. I want to do this for her before she's gone. I want to make her proud. And so you kind of just learned that. And it wasn't like just my hook to get them. And I just want them to know that there is somebody that's still out there rooting for them. And they knew I was rooting for them on the inside. And there were people on the outside rooting for them. And I had to always find out who that was and remind them along the way that so-and-so is still out there waiting for this, and they are going to be so proud of you. And I would go in their housing units every once in a while. Like if they didn't show up for class a couple of times, I'd start to worry. I have to write them up or whatever the case may be, but I would always go talk to them before I wrote them up to say, hey, my big thing is, are you emotionally okay? Is anything going on? And I'd always say, you don't have to tell me details. I just, and some of them would say, no, so-and-so's going on the outside. I can't think, and what people don't really remember is I hear a lot of times, well, they're in prison. They don't have anything to worry about. Oh, only everything that's happening on the outside that they can't help do. And so a lot of times, I'd just go check and make sure. And that would always be a lot of their thing would be their families at home and how they could help them. And so once they would open up about that, we would, open that conversation, let the wall down, and we go back and do class again. But it was usually their mama. And once we made that connection, and I would remind them, they wanted to work hard for her. And there were very few, thank goodness, that didn't have their mom around anymore. And so we would talk about, who else? His sister, brother, dad, and but their family's all they have. And so thank goodness I didn't come across anybody that didn't have anybody on the outside waiting for them. And I know that there are so many that don't have anybody rooting for them. But whenever I'd find them, I called mom today and I told her I passed this test and she is so excited. And like I said earlier, it's just like a kid in a grown man's body. They want to make you proud of them. They want to do good. Right. You just got to get to that part where they want it. And that's the key with so much of what I did with them.
Yeah, treating them as human beings.
Yes.
Something that's been thrown away.
Yes. And that's what I would always tell them. They would, we were taught in the academy to call them offenders. Offender Jones, Offender Smith, Offender, that was their name in prison. I did not do that. I called them just by their last name. I never called them offender. In the beginning I did, because that's what I was taught in the academy. That's what you do. In my very first group of students, I said, where's offender so-and-so? And one guy he was like, stop saying that. It's like, dude, what? Calm down. He was like, we don't like that. And I was like, okay, tell me more, and so they all kind of put in their, their 2 cents about it. And I said, deal. You'll never hear that word from me again. That's not a problem. I said, what I do need you to know is to everybody out there, maybe you are offender so-and-so. To me, you're a man, then my student, then you're an offender. I need you to remember that you're a human and you're a man and you're in here and you're my student above all else things. When you're sitting in front of me and I'm teaching you and I'm sitting next to you and we're working on algebra, I'm not sitting there thinking what your charge is. I don't care. You are my student and you need my help. And we're going to do this as a team. We're working this as a team. We are like a family in these four walls. And I don't care what your label is on the outside. And so once they realized that I felt that way, I voiced it and was sincere, those walls did drop. And like you said, and like I said, I had notes from some earlier, and they would say stuff like, we're just like cattle running through here. No one cares. We're not treated like people. And once I soaked that in and didn't just bawl from the fact that they said that, when you hear for a couple of people say, you're like, okay, look, what did you do? But after groups and groups of them, I thought, no, they really are. And so then I would walk on the yard and see and hear, and I got what they were saying. I tried harder to make sure they remembered that they were men and fathers and brothers and sons and students, and that was above their label of being a felon. And that was really important to them, to be treated like humans. It's like they almost forgot they were. And that breaks my heart.
Yeah. So I have to ask this one question, just because,
Sure.
I think a lot of people think about doing various work with the prison population, etc. But the first thing that's going to pop into people's head is the fear of doing that. So you went from teaching elementary to working in a prison. Were you ever afraid? Did you ever feel unsafe? Did you, we've all worked in professional environments. And so is that environment different? Is it, yes, you were shut down, but I'm just talking about the overall sort of scope of things, if you know what I mean. So let's talk about the fear for a minute.
Okay.
Existing at all.
Well, I didn't feel any fear. The only time, honestly, I would look up what any of my students had done is when I worked in diagnostics. I had an office, and we all had small offices in this huge area. And yes, there was no like ceiling. So it's like cubicles with walls is what it was. But if I was going to be alone in a classroom with someone for a period of time, I would look up just to kind of give a heads up to anybody around me if it was something that I needed to be concerned about. But other than that, I didn't feel fear. I remember kind of being nervous the first time I walked out of my building and walked out into the prison yard. And it wasn't so much fear. It was, I knew all eyes were on me. And I'm about as outgoing as you can get, but it was just strange because you look and there's buildings everywhere and they're tall and you see men staring out those windows. My thought was, oh my gosh, that fear was never something I felt. And what I did learn pretty quick, and was probably one of the coolest things, was once I started teaching my classes in the education department, and I had these groups, like I said, up to 10 men in a classroom, 3 classes a day. They were very protective. And I don't mean weird, creepy. I mean like cousins, brothers. They did not like me going into a housing unit without one of them near me. I remember one time saying, man, I got to cross the yard, and they were having rec time. So there would be hundreds of men out on the yard, and which did not scare me at all. I did not care. I'd just go out there, but they didn't like that. And so they would be like, hey, can you wait to go to the yard when class is over? Cause we'll escort you over there. And yeah, I got catcalled. I got all the other things like you would expect in a prison. I can brush that off. That does not bother me. Whatever, you get that walking down the highway sometimes, crossing the street sometimes, or driving down the highway in a busy area, whatever. But as far as fear, I never felt that. And once I had those students, they really would. And it was such a totally different feeling to have them walk with you, because they knew people would be like, oh, okay, yeah, we're not going to say anything to her. I mean, everything, no catcalling, no looking, no anything when my students were with me. And they were very protective. I went to a housing unit one day to ask a man, you haven't come in 3 days. Are you okay? And he started kind of mouthing, which I brush off, whatever. I was still not fearful of him by any means. And he was like, I don't have to tell you where I am. Well, I guess I'm pretty loud. And so another person down the hallway in his housing unit wing heard my voice, and he stepped out. He's like, bro, do not raise your voice at her. That is my teacher, and you will be respectful. And I was like, and so, it's just like having my core people. They were always on the lookout for me. I even had a man who was not a student of mine that had been in prison for years and years and years. And he was an older man, probably in his early 70s. And he kind of just, I would tutor my students. I'd go out of my way in between classes, and I would go to a housing unit, had a gym. And so if we were this close from getting, their high set or their GED, I would go in there and tutor them. He always sat outside the gym, just that was his chill time. Instead of going outside for rec, he'd sit and chill. And so he saw me in there working with them really hard all the time. And one day, a guy had given me a hard time in my classroom, and I had removed him and told him he was no longer welcome until he could get his attitude straight. And things get, passed around in prison real fast. So I went later that afternoon to go tutor, and that older man stopped me and he said, so-and-so was talking about you earlier. And I was like, oh, it's fine, whatever. He was like, no, it is not fine. You are a good person, and I will not allow anyone to talk to you about you that way. And so it's just like you said, it kind of becomes family. I don't know another way to say that. When you respect them, they will respect you to the end of time, and they will take up for you. And so I felt just the opposite of fearful on that yard, because I had people watching out for me. And as silly as it is, I feel like if I were to ever run into any of them in public, I think I'd get a huge hug. And I think I would get just watching out, don't touch her, don't mess with her. I just felt like I had a lot of people watching out for me because I watched out for them in different ways. So fearful was definitely not something I was. But yeah, a lot of my students asked me, which I thought was interesting, your husband doesn't mind you working in a men's prison? No, why would he? Well, we're a men's prison. People say stuff. And I was like, well, he knows I can hold my own, and he knows why I'm here. And, but that was always a question too. Doesn't that bother him? No. But my husband knows me well enough to know that I do what I do because I love it. And I made a difference, and that's why I showed up every day. But yeah, fearful was so far from what I was with them.
Wow. Honestly, I'm like, you've blown me away for an hour.
Thank you.
Now I know why Shantae loves you so much.
Thank you.
This has been amazing. This has been such an insightful conversation that we need to be having so much more often.
Absolutely.
But I can't thank you enough for taking the time to get on this Zoom with me and have this conversation. And I'm almost speechless, and I'm almost never speechless, but I'm so blown away by everything that you said. So I can't thank you enough.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I love, first of all, just voicing what it's like to be in a prison. Some people don't even know that education in a prison is a thing. Yeah. They never really thought about it. And the fact that it is a thing, and it's more needed than anybody could ever know. And so many different kinds of education besides receiving that piece of paper is so needed for those men and ladies that are out there.
Yeah, definitely. Well, hopefully this conversation goes to changing some things, because they shouldn't just be doing workbooks. They should be having dedicated teachers who are committed to helping them achieve the education that they didn't get.
Absolutely. I think that's the only way they'll ever succeed is to know that, that communication and the caring. And like I said earlier, they're not going to care until we do. And it's just like with any other student.
Right.
Thanks for having me, Ashley. I've loved it so much.
Thank you. I'm going to probably watch this all weekend long. I'm going to drive my family crazy. I want to soak this up even more. So thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Everybody, I hope you enjoyed this because I know I did. Take care.